Clinton. Now he's saying he didn't say that, but nevertheless, this was all as a ruse to get him to talk about the issue of adoption of Russian babies. But at the same time, the article we've posted here by David French, there is now evidence that senior Trump officials attempted to collude with Russia. Whether it was a collusion, attempted collusion, or whatever, but Chelsey, we've got some issues now that are on the table that weren't there just a few days ago, right?
We have a lot of issues to deal with as a country. I think that this is definitely, I always say this, I feel like I'm just on repeat, but this is indefensible, it's unsavory, but it is not illegal.
Yes.
And so I think that's important as a country to understand that we have to draw that line. Is unfortunate. I agree. I agree with that, Nick. Absolutely. But what we have here, it's uneducated, unsophisticated businessmen running our country like a business. And I think that they forget there are lines of propriety here. Now I could go through all the legal terms that the liberals you'll hear being thrown out. Collusion is actually not a legal term of art. It is not a crime. And the only way that it is a crime is when it involves antitrust laws. So obviously not applicable here. That's more of a political term for collaborating with. So keep that in mind as you're hearing these buzz terms. Espionage Act, no violation there. He was not exchanging. He did not exchange American information. I also think people forget that the Trump enterprise had business relationships with this attorney. And so they likely thought, oh, this is a friend we're meeting with, someone we've had a long record of a friendship and business dealings with. Again, indefensible, but something to keep in mind. And then the third thing I'll say is they're trying to make a stretch that this somehow breached the Campaign Finance Act because there was an exchange of information, and they're going to say that was valuable information. Yeah. I would just posit that if that is the case, then every journalist who's ever run an international story has breached the Campaign Finance Act.
And I think you bring up a really great point in the sense that, one, there's the unsavory component. I think that's a key component. And then two, what we're going to see is this is just a long-standing relationship that now has come, that's arisen what was 3 years ago, or what was last year that was a 3-year relationship, and now is a 4-year relationship. So just a brief precursor. What we have is an individual named Amin, who is a 30-something-year-old pop star that performed at the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow. Amin developed a relationship with Donald Trump. Donald Trump had him perform at some of his clubhouses all throughout the country, even to the extent that Donald Trump would send a happy birthday video to Amin on his birthday. Amin would have Donald Trump be in a cameo appearance in one of his music videos. Amin reaches out to his publicist, which is a guy named Rob Goldstone. He tells Rob Goldstone that his father, Aras, has information from someone that they would like to get connected because it would be advantageous for the Trump campaign. Rob Goldstone, the music publicist, then reaches out to the campaign. Donald Trump Jr. reaches out to the campaign and says, we have information that, one, is very highly sensitive material and high level, and then two, indicates the support that the Russian government has for a Trump presidency. So Donald Trump Jr. says, quote, in the email, I love it. They set up a meeting, quickly learned that nothing came about from it. It was really just a ploy to be able to change a public policy position on adoption because there are 650,000 orphans in Russia right now. Yeah. And just at the end of the day, we see the intention for collusion, an attempted collusion, but wasn't collusion. And
which is not a legal term, as we just pointed out.
Not a legal term. But then what's really indicting is what we're going to continue to see, and I think what's going to continue to play out is, one, these were sources inside the White House that were willing to reveal this one. So who has it out for Donald Trump Jr.? And then what was Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort doing in that meeting? Specifically Kushner, now that he's serving in the administration.
Right.
So it befuddles me right now. I'm shocked and awed by, I'll call my party out. I'm shocked and awed by conservatives and Republicans that are trying to side and trying to put up a veneer or trying to shift the blame over to Hillary. At the end of the day, let faithful are the wounds of a friend. Let's call a wrong and let's try to move on from it, or at least try to get to the bottom of it.
It's one of the reasons I put the David French piece up there. Of course, David French thought about even running against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So I thought you did get a chance to hear somebody that was somewhat critical. And we got some good legal analysis from Chelsey, but when we come back, I have some legal analysis from Jonathan Turley and what he had to say. Because some say that this is perjury, some say it is treason. What does law professor Jonathan Turley say? We'll hear that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Most people would expect liberals to be open-minded, and yet they find that they are often the most intolerant. Kim Holmes explores the reason for this transformation in his new book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind. He was on my radio program to talk about the history of the radical change in mindset and attitude. Now, classical American liberalism in this country was based on a belief in liberty. Citizens were to be free from government coercion, and thus free to believe something different from the orthodoxy forced on it by the state. They were also free to discuss and debate, and most importantly was a belief in true tolerance, which accepted the right and freedom of others to believe differently from you. It was a live and let live philosophy. I may disagree with your views, but I would defend your right to believe them. That is not the view of the postmodern left today. They practice the politics of intolerance. They may think that they are tolerant, but really live in a world where bigotry and discrimination are allowed against any view that is not politically correct. They are willing to stifle free thought, censor free speech, and use public shaming in order to suppress any idea they do not like. Now, in his book, he talks about the campus bullies, but we also discussed how this has moved into even the business world. Now we have corporate bullies willing to use economic power to stifle and suppress legislation they abhor. He says we have a new ruling class that is wealthy, smart, well-connected, and formidable. Although their numbers are small, actually in the thousands, their influence in the media, in the academy, and in government is significant. They also believe that they have a higher truth which is superior to the common wisdom of the day. You know, we're in a battle with a new kind of liberal mind, and that is why we need to read about the closing of the liberal mind. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Nip Hicks in studio with us, Chelsey Youman. It is our Millennial Round Table, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to move on a little bit later into some other topics, but if you have some thoughts about the scandal, if you will, or the news right now about Donald Trump Jr. and some of the things that have been revealed over the last 36 to 72 hours. And as far as we can tell, Nick, we haven't had any new shoes drop in the last few minutes. But we're
good. We're 10 minutes past we first started. We're good right now.
No more revelations. Okay, let me get into this. Chelsey, you did a good job of talking about the legal issues, but I thought we might go to Jonathan Turley. He is an individual that I really appreciate sometimes, because when some of his fellow progressives kind of go off the ranch, or maybe they're out in front of their skis. This is a new term everybody's using right now. He kind of wants to pull them back. He's a professor at George Washington University, an individual that really has pretty much supported many of these progressive ideas, but sometimes he just wants to say, guys, calm down a little bit. When people start talking about perjury and criminal activity and even treason. He was on with Martha McCallum, and here's what Jonathan Turley had to say.
Well, it's odd. It's like we have this giant Rorschach test where everyone sees ink blots and sees crimes everywhere. I mean, the criminal code has defined elements to it. You just don't find these ambiguous crimes. Some people have said this could be treason. For the love of God, treason is defined in the Constitution. This is not treason. Other people have said this could be a Logan Act violation. Well, Logan Act has been used once in 200 years and is facially unconstitutional. One said, well, if you take things of tangible value under the campaign laws and treat information like that, then maybe you have a campaign contribution violation. Well, yeah, but we haven't seen that done. You could also treat it like a panda and say it's an endangered species violation. But courts haven't done that. So I think that people need to take a breath. You know, this was a meeting where someone said they had evidence of a possible crime by the opponent of the Trump campaign. They met with this person. I think a lot of people in the city view that as naive. I think a lot of people say, my God, why didn't you use a surrogate, which is how it's done in Washington? But that itself is not a crime.
So again, that's just a little bit of a commentary. I hear the law professor at George Washington University saying the same things that you've been saying, Chelsey.
That's right. I mean, that's right. We cannot just invent new crimes. We have a law we have to abide by. Again, it's completely politically inappropriate, ethically inappropriate. I don't know that shocks me coming out of the Trump administration. He was not elected based on his very conservative evangelical ethics and values. This is not a shock to me.
Yeah, and so, but again, at the end of the day, and I know I'm going to be, what was it, the panda? I'll be the sad panda right now. Like, I just want to believe that we're better than this, right? Like, I want to believe that I should assume that that leaders within the party, and technically he's leader of the party, because then there's some that are just going to say, well, it's just his son. Well, Ivanka's just his daughter, and she got a position at the G20 table. So don't just tell me like it's just his son. Like he was in leadership, okay? So he was in leadership right now, and I would expect us to assume that they're going to act legally. I want them to set exemplar examples for us, because as George Washington said, religion and morality are the essential pillars of a civil society. That they are buttressing this democratic republic experiment, and I would expect leaders to be individuals that we can point to. And so I'm just extremely disappointed in this. I'm saddened by individuals that continue to try to shift the blame towards Hillary, because again, we're conservatives. We look to the past, but we're trying to create a more productive and efficient future. We're not trying to lament about it.
Yeah.
So,
well, and again, some people said that if there was somebody who came to the Hillary campaign and said, we've got Donald Trump's taxes, they probably would have taken it too. But can we raise the level of discourse?
And that's a great thing. Like, I'm all for, let's get his tax returns. I mean, can we just be honest for a second that the sponsor, Aras Araganabov, I think is his name, he and the sponsors gave $20+ million for the naming rights and to be able to bring Miss Universe pageant to Moscow. After the Miss Universe pageant, there was literally Donald Trump tweeted, "Great weekend. Amen was wow. Trump Tower, Moscow." Like, let's bring some of this out. Light is the greatest disinfectant. Let's start hearing the call again to be able to see the release of these records.
Let's talk about what you might have done differently, because if nothing else, maybe we can pass on a lesson to those that are involved in a campaign. If somebody comes up to you, whether from a foreign government or this government, and they say, I have evidence of criminal activity, who's your first phone call?
Who are you going to call?
FBI.
Ghostbusters. No. Oh, sorry.
Who are you going to call?
Yeah.
But,
first, I was going to say first FBI, but then a journalist.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think the American public has a right to know the tax question. They have a right to see that information, just like they did have a right to know what was really going on in the Hillary emails, which I think, obviously everyone is against Russian espionage in our country and trying to affect our election. But at the end of the day, it is upon the journalists. That burden is on the journalists. They have a duty to be finding out this information the public people need to know.
And that's what we want to champion. Like, again, I know journalism is not perfect, but show me perfection here in the American society, right? There's nothing that is perfect here. And so, yes, there is some fake news. There is. But I would dare say there is biased news in a far greater quantity than fake news. And we need to put a stop to this whole idea that everything's fake, right? Because all it's doing is tearing at the foundations of our society, because when you're calling everything fake and you can't create this level of trust, what we're going to continue to see is chaos. And in chaos, the strong person wins.
Okay, this is a Millennial Round Table. We've got two millennials here. There is some damage that was done, and I think part of it is it just reinforces a millennial's skepticism about politics. Or am I off?
No. I feel like I'm talking all of it right now, Chelsey. Come on, somebody.
That's why I sat here, because I knew you had a lot to say.
Again, we see millennials are increasingly disenchanted with the process, and they're looking for any reason to be further disenchanted. And this is just yet another reason. And it's not just on the right, it's also on the left, because you've got Tim Kaine, which, again, there's a microphone in everybody's mouth now, constantly 24/7. You can't go anywhere without having what you believe broadcast before the larger world. And then Tim Kaine, with his loose lips, mentions treason, and now that's complete. That's become a bigger part. That's become a part of the story as well. And again, as millennials, we're further increasingly checking out with this, and this is just not the posture.
But the ironic part is that desire to kind of buck the establishment and get away from the establishment. I mean, that's what got Trump elected. I mean, he is supposed to be the anti-establishment candidate, and so I think at the end of the day, it goes to show that we have to have knowledgeable and experienced individuals that are running, people who are credible for the position, people who have the resume for the position, even if they've been in politics for a few years. They just have to be moral people and ethical people.
And I think you bring up a great point. What individual here in the United States would look on someone with experience when they're looking to hire someone and say, no thank. No, but politics should be the same to a large degree. Politics should be the same as a law firm, should be the same as a plumbing company. We're looking for experience. And so this whole idea of we don't want career politicians, or we want to buck the establishment, we want new people. There is a value to knowing the inner workings in the process.
To having a voting record.
To having a voting record, to knowing the bureaucratic structure. And so to kind of lament and throw out the baby with the bathwater and say that we don't want anyone that has experience, it's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. Now, granted, there is something to be said for an individual that doesn't live underneath the laws that they've been governed, right? Like, I think there's something wrong with that. But we don't have to go 0 to 100.
Over under on if we think that all of this is going to actually push conservative millennials towards a really, really good candidate next time.
Yeah, could possibly.
Maybe we'll actually appreciate out of this, 17 primary candidates we had running. Maybe this will push people towards one of the more valiant candidates that are out there.
Yeah, and then you think about this if we put on our political hats for a second, and we think about this from the 2018 election. Midterm elections traditionally have always been bad elections. Midterm elections have been bad elections for the party that's in power. But right now, if Democrats continue to show this as an impeachment case, as an impeachment election, that's going to turn out that base that just brought Trump to the White House. And again, what we're going to continue to see, what we're seeing right now, is Democrats don't have the leadership, and they don't have those candidates that are really going to be able to buttress, or really going to be viable candidates in the election. I think it's going to be fascinating from a political standpoint.
Well, again, if you want to lose the next election, keep Nancy Pelosi in a position of leadership right now, and have Tim Kaine, who is the vice presidential nominee, say that it's treason. And that's going to turn off a lot of people.
And maybe it's just because I'm extremely biased because I spent 3 years studying Kennedy. But I think millennials, and I think the American public at large, want someone that's going to cast a big vision for us. What the 80s children had to tear down the wall, the 60s children, we're going to send a man to the moon. We want a big vision to come underneath and do our part to be able to see its enactment.
That's for sure. That gets into things like American exceptionalism and the speech and a few other things. We have a lot more to cover, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Nick and Chelsey in studio. We'd love to hear from you as well. We'll be back right after this.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys. And what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Millennial Round Table today, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Nick Pitt's with us, Chelsey Youman. We will, before the end of this hour, talk a little bit about both of their websites. Great material for you, and of course, we've posted a number of articles, one about the attempted collusion with Russia, but another one that came out from our good friends at the Family Research Council, creatively called On Guard Against Rationing, and it says the best argument against Obamacare may be lying quietly in a London hospital. Not even a year-old tiny Charlie Gard rests peacefully, completely unaware of the global crusade to keep him alive. Lots of issues to address here, but again, the desire on the part of the parents, Connie Yates and Chris Gard, is to have this 11-month-old to leave the hospital and come to the United States for potentially life-saving treatment. Now, it's very experimental, and there, again, we have to be real careful because some people are saying this shows that we should not have rationing. This shows the problem with the British healthcare system and the rest. But if nothing else, you can understand a mother, can't you, Chelsey? Imagine if your son, Foster, were in that hospital bed. Wouldn't you want to do, you and your husband want to do anything you could to try to save his life?
You know, it is tragic. It's unthinkable. And I mean, I can't even talk in too much detail without getting emotional about it. Just no parent should be put in this position. First of all, the devastation of having a child with such a terminal illness.
Yes.
But secondly, to have a court, in this case, it was a family court, decide that not only could the doctors that did not want to continue to provide the medical services do that the hospital had to essentially end this child's life. And that goes a step too far, you know, drawing the line, and Nick has some, I'm sure, some things to say about drawing the line between this and Obamacare, but I want to talk about, does a judge have a right in a family court to say that this child no longer can receive any medical care? You know, we've all heard of conscience rights protections for doctors and nurses. For instance, in America, doctors and nurses do not have to perform abortions. That's a medical service they can choose. It's a mutual relationship not to provide. But in this instance, there are other doctors who are stepping up to provide those services. So to say that even those doctors can't provide services, I think is really egregious. And then the only other question I think being determined is, okay, is this borderline abuse? That's really where the courts are supposed to be stepping in. And there's no evidence that this child that he is undergoing pain or that he's really, really suffering. They have, you know, questions as to whether, I think only 16 children in the entire world have ever been diagnosed with this specific disease. And so there's a lot of unknown about it, but there are experimental drugs that have shown in other cases to be beneficial. And so just letting these parents have the right, human rights acts internationally acknowledge that parents should have the right over the medical decisions of their children as they do any other decision relating to their children.
Okay, so unlike the previous 30 minutes where I had an opinion on everything, I have a question on many things with this because, again, this is a law component and there's a medical component that I don't quite understand. And so I'm trying to understand is it tick for tack? Is it an A to A comparison between the British system and our system? Because I would imagine in the American system, if a parent wants to take a child out,
right,
they would have that freedom to do that. Is it not like that in Britain?
You know, I can't speak too much to the British law on this situation, but I can say that we do also have family courts here who are supposed to be deciding. In this case, both countries, the standard is quote unquote best interest of the child, and that's what that court made their determination based on that standard. We don't think it's in the best interest of the child to continue his life. And that essentially, it could presumably happen here. I mean, a family court could step in and say the suffering is too great, it borders on abuse or neglect, and step in. In this scenario, I think it's important to note that that's not the case. The doctors are saying he doesn't seem to be in pain. He's 11 months old. And there are procedures that could potentially save his life out there. Other people willing to step in.
If he's not suffering right now and he's just kind of maintaining a low status quo,
right,
you would say, do you know if there is a danger in transporting him that might enforce the doctor's opinion that he shouldn't be moved?
I think that they were looking into that, and so the resolution they came up with was U.S. doctors actually are wanting to send these drugs and these experimental methods and treatments over to England. so that he doesn't have to be transported. And it's now going to be a question practically, is the British government going to allow those treatments to enter the country?
That's fascinating, because I think about it from so there's the Eastern standpoint where there's so much honor in it, right? And so you're wanting to save face, and so you would never want to accept something like that, or not never, but typically you wouldn't want to see that kind of help kind of coming about it. And so I wonder, I'm just very interested in, one, how the British system has the ability to be able to keep the children, keep the parents from taking the child out. One, two, the child's condition to such an extent. Would it be harmful or suffering to his medical status if he were to be transported? And then three, is this, if I just look at it, if I think about it, I'm trying to channel the spirit of David Gergen or Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and to understand the basic premise of the liberal worldview is that the government can change the culture, and the conservative worldview is that the family is foundational to the culture. Hence the reason why the parents have the best interest of the child. I'm just trying to understand this, because it's just unfathomable.
And we have to remember too that no parent is going to want to watch their child be in pain and suffering. And so she even she made a point that, look, I could not sit here in this hospital every day for 11 months and watch my child endure pain and suffering. So you have to remember the human component of this as well, that those parents care more and love that child more than anyone else will, and they truly have the best interest of that child in mind.
Let me give you a quote that comes from Wesley J. Smith. He's been on the program with us many times before. This is in First Things, which I think very highly of. And he's asked the question, whose baby is Charlie Gard anyway? That is the crucial question. And what follows, who has the right to determine his care? We put care in quotes here because what the British government insists it must do cannot be called care. Charlie's parents want to rescue him. They understand that the odds are against him, but like all great parents, they are not only willing but are anxious to take those odds and fight for the life of their child. They want to truly care for their child in a way that only parents can. They love him in a way an institution, hospital or government cannot. It goes on from there, but really a fundamental question about the rights of parents. And Chelsey, oftentimes when you have a court step in, it's because of withdrawing care. The classic illustration is maybe a Seventh-day, well, probably a better one would be Jehovah's Witness not having a blood transfusion or something of that nature, or a Christian Science parent or something like that. In this case, it's just the opposite. The court stepping in and saying, no, we will not allow you to pursue experimental treatment, even though $1.6 million has been raised if we want to take him overseas or treat him even there. So this is a little different in terms of British common law, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And we are getting into a realm where this is becoming more and more common in the we call it bioethics. Medical bioethics questions are starting to be decided in a court of law. And it's really discouraging to see that. We have embryos, frozen embryos of people who are undergoing IVF treatment, and they've got these frozen baby embryos left over. So possibly snowflake children that could be born. Yes, and
just on babies on ice, basically.
Yes, that is so true. And if you believe in life like we do as Christians, that it begins at conception. These are unborn children frozen in time, and we have courts making determinations to destroy embryos. They're being used in divorce battles. That happened in California 2 years ago.
Or the one in Kentucky, where the woman, she had her eggs and she wanted to have more. They'd had a divorce, and he said, wait a minute, I'll have to have I pay child custody, alimony, and everything. And I don't want more babies. So that was a big case. They called it the Lego Maegos case, because it could not actually decide whether or not she could implant those embryos, because the laws would then say he'd have to pay for ones even though they were divorced. So,
yep, that's right.
Crazy.
And then even to the end of life questions of euthanasia and statutes being passed in different states now, following the trend of allowing people to die with dignity and have doctors do euthanasia. This is all a death culture that's been perpetuating for a very long time. And I think that we have to take a stand against it.
I mean, you're even seeing this played out within, it's being popularized right now in the theaters, right? There was the movie Me Before You. There was the movie, what's the one?
Baby.
What is it? What's the funny one, the really sad one? I read the book by John Green. Oh, it's not going to come to me right now. I can tell you, Looking for Alaska was the one that preceded it. Nevertheless, you've got Me Before You that talks about an individual that wants to have medical euthanasia because of he's prehabilitated. And then you've got I just wonder about the role of the government in this, and I think the religious component is an interesting point, because religious individuals have an ability to be able to withhold medical treatment if it violates their conscience. What role does the parent have a role in this particular point to where they can pull back, or what is the role of the government then that they can keep in? And what do we not know? I'm just interested. What do we not know? Because it just seems illogical to me right now, the way that this story's playing out.
Well, and when we come back from the break, I want to talk about rationing, because they say, well, is this an example of rationing? But if you look around, we already sort of have rationing, and that was an argument about the so-called death panels and everything on Obamacare. So we have a lot more to cover. Your comments are welcome. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A Massachusetts church is accused of violating the separation of church and state because it rents space from the local school district. Town leaders of Southbridge, Massachusetts have raised concerns about Iglesia Casa de Destinos' rented use of a public school in its town. The church pays the standard rate to use the school's auditorium once per week, like many churches do across the country. But the church is known in the community for its conservative religious beliefs. One of the town councilmen is openly questioning whether the church should have a standing agreement to use the property. Not only is the building expensive to operate, the councilman suggested that the agreement could violate the so-called separation of church and state. Well, not likely. The Supreme Court has twice upheld the practice. A town is, of course, under no obligation to rent its facility to anyone, but historically, publicly owned schools have been used and rented by a variety of organizations, including churches. Once a school district decides that it will rent its facilities to the community, it would be unlawful religious discrimination to prevent churches from renting the space. As the Supreme Court observed in the 1981 decision of Widmer versus Vincent, the Constitution forbids a state to enforce certain exclusions from a forum generally open to the public, even if it was not required to create the forum in the first place. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We cover everything here on Point of View, from politics and economics to bioethics. We haven't talked about that in a while, but lots of issues. And let me take a phone call that will, I think, stimulate some of our conversations. So we'll head out to Maine. First of all, Bob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you for having me. Just briefly was mentioned a minute or two ago about euthanasia, and they're basically status quo. The status quo is kind of pumping advanced directives at us every time we go to the hospital or a doctor. And from what I gather, the protective medical documents are far superior. And I think the Patients' Rights Council, they're still in force. in operation, they used to supply them for like $15 donation or something, and they're far superior to the other.
Yes, well, again, advanced directives, durable power of attorney, all sorts of things, living wills. Really need to start thinking through this. We've done programs in the past, and I think it's about time to bring them back here again. And the other aspect, Chelsey, you were saying off air, just this whole issue of in vitro fertilization. You have all sorts of cases where you've had surrogate mothers that have decided to keep the child. The so-called Baby M case where William and Elizabeth Stern contracted with Mary Beth, and so she decided to keep the child. So then in the court of New Jersey, it was the ultimate Solomon dilemma. Are you going to give the child to the couple or to the surrogate mother? And they don't issue swords there in the New Jersey court like they did with King Solomon. So basically, they gave it to her. You had the reverse of that in Michigan with Williams, with another particular group as well. When the child was born with some medical defects, and neither wanted the child, and so they had to figure these cases out. So all sorts of issues involving artificial reproduction, euthanasia. This is an area where I would hope that the legislatures and the courts would go slow, because sometimes if you write into law the best medical care at that time, medicine moves a lot faster than what happens in the courts or even what happens in the legislatures, doesn't it?
That's so true. And, this is just to say off the bat that this is such a dark subject and should be. It should be disconcerting to everyone out there. I mean, this is a culture we have to fight against, a culture that brought about abortion has now moved 30 years later in a very, very dark direction. And I think that we are now called, the millennials, I'm going to tout this on behalf of millennials because we don't get to tout on millennials very often. They're calling themselves the pro-life culture.
Yes, and they are. The most pro-life generation in history.
It's true. And so I am just, prayerful and hopeful that seeing how bad this has gone, that now courts of law are deciding on the destruction of embryos are being used as bargaining chips in divorce battles. That is not a place for the courts to be, frankly. And so just making sure that we are asking ourselves these hard questions. We're not putting our head in the sand on these issues of end of life, euthanasia question. It's one and the same question. If you are pro-life, you are pro-life in all facets.
I completely agree. And so
we need Jim Denison and Nick Pitts right now. Never needed them before.
I look at it from the cultural perspective, because obviously I haven't seen Law and Order lately, so I can't speak at it from the legal perspective. So I have just
you won't find it there.
Oh crap! Well, but then so the movie I was talking about earlier was The Fault in Our Stars. We're seeing the popularization of, one, euthanasia, but then two, suicide, which I think is just another startling thing. So not going through medical channels, just taking the onus upon themselves. And we've seen an uptick in suicide rates by 24% over the past 15 years. There have been 600,000 suicides over the past 16 years, with 2015 being the most suicides we've seen in U.S. history. And so I think we need to increasingly be aware of the normalization, one, and the viability of suicide, especially among millennials right now. Because what we know to be true is that we're suffering from a loneliness plague right now, where we're increasingly not becoming part of communities, and it's in isolation that individuals begin to believe the lies and the deceptions that ultimately believe they're a problem. But what we recognize is that people have problems. People are never problems. But we're just not seeing that right now. And so it's just increasingly important for, one, individuals to point out the viability and be pro-life, but two, for the church to be the church and to speak life into these things, because they're following after the one that has come to give them life, and life to the fullest.
Back in Colorado, when we had Governor Richard Lamb, that goes back many years ago, he said that individuals have a duty to die. And if you go into clinics, especially maybe cancer wards or places like that, they almost apologize for taking up a hospital bed. So this kind of mindset that I need to just get out of the way is, again, one of those kind of dark, if you will, the result of an abortion culture that led to much more. And I remember when I was at Kennedy Institute of Bioethics, we were making the case back then that every argument for abortion is also an argument for infanticide and euthanasia. And your generation is now seeing that playing out in ways that we never would have seen if we hadn't really been on the front end of understanding what that might mean.
Yes, and I've also heard the argument in philosophy, take it for what it's worth. I'm not quite sure that I've wrapped my head around it yet, but that, we've removed a lot of the moral compass from our country. And so when God and your natural rights, there's no longer these principles of truth we're grounded in, the next biggest moral compass we have, or principle of truth that we're seeing the culture go to, is a sense of self. And we are now, creating a sense of self and my own identity, and my destiny is in my hands, as our God. And we are seeing a very, de-Christianized culture go to the extent, not only is my body is my own, my gender identity is my own, my sexual orientation is my own, to now like my death and my demise, something that typically is not in your control. It's only in the control of God, your maker, taking that into your own hands.
Yeah. And again, I've beat this drum quite a few times, but what we're continuing to see is the eradication of these intermediary institutions that have typically given us a sense of identity outside of ourselves. So people aren't going to church, which would be from the Judeo-Christian perspective, or they're not even going to Rotary Club. They're not going to Kiwanis. They're not participating in the Salvation Army. These are things that have often given us a sense of value and worth. And if you're not a Christian, have also given you a sense of identity. They've given you a reason to wake up in the morning. And when we're seeing individuals disengage from these, what we're seeing is that they're disengaging from them. And then two, they're going into their isolated circles and spheres. So even back in 1985, an individual had on average 3.5 friends. Well, that same study that was done 5 years ago, they only have 1.8 friends now. That 51% of Americans don't know their neighbors. What we're seeing is individuals that are increasingly being isolated, but then not engaging in communities. And that's having unintended consequences that inevitably are rippling out to the destruction.
We have an international example of this. My husband and I did a mission trip to Japan a couple years ago. And so you're bringing all this to mind. But in Japan, culturally, they have very small circles of friends, stay close with the family. And in addition, they're having a new phenomenon called Hikikorama, I think is what it's called, where people become, at our age, in the millennial generation, complete recluses. And they disappear, and they live in their parents' basements, and they do video games all day, and they just completely isolate and disconnect from the world. And it's no secret that Japan has the highest suicide rate in the entire world, that these less than 0.1% of the population are Christian. And so when you see this separation from your God and your maker, in addition to separation from your communities and isolation, it does lead to depression rates.
Yeah, and you can look up on YouTube, because we think it's kind of funny, and I even highlight it in the daily briefing every once in a while, but they're individuals that are eating, and they're just videoing themselves eating. There's a term for it, but I'm from Tennessee and I can't pronounce it. It's like this term where individuals are literally live streaming themselves eating, because one, they want to have that type of connection, and because they're so isolated right now, that to the extent that this is even rippling out, because the marriage rates are even plummeting over there right now. And what you're seeing with the marriage rates plummeting was because they don't have time, because their sense of value and worth is tied to their vocation. So they're increasingly giving more of their time to vocation, which sounds eerily familiar to here in the U.S.
Wow. We have a lot more to cover in the second hour, how we are ruining America.
Oh, boy.
David Brooks. And also, want to get some comments around the table about the speech by Donald Trump last week on Western civilization. We'll be back right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Pitt's with us here today, and so we're all around the round table. We get guest hosts, we have former host, and everybody around the round table on our Millennial Round Table today.
It's like a circus, and I'll be the clown, everybody. I'll be the clown.
And Chelsey. So Nick and Chelsey and Kerby all around the table. We spent some time in that first hour talking about everything from Donald Trump Jr. as well to the whole issue of bioethics. And I think most of us are depressed, so maybe we need to move on to something else. But if you'd like to join us on that, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles I posted, though, is by Dennis Prager, in which he said that the Atlantic rendered a great service because after the speech last week by President Donald Trump in Warsaw, which many people really enjoyed and really appreciated, we had even Gary Bauer on the other day talking about, as an individual that was a domestic policy advisor for Ronald Reagan, there were parts of the speech by Donald Trump that seemed very Reagan-esque. But nevertheless, in the Atlantic, the argument is that here, where he makes quotes about the West and civilization, that at least Peter Breinart and a couple of others are arguing that these are like dog whistles to white supremacy. And I think it illustrates, again, Nick and Chelsey, what's going on the college campus.
Yeah, I just found what was so fascinating is that, again, they've taken a position, some on the left, I don't want to say the entire left, some on the left have taken a position whereby they cannot celebrate, nor can they honor, nor can they respect our president when he actually does something right. And I think you lose legitimacy in the eyes of the public when you just take this adversarial stance or this praiseworthy stance constantly, right? Yeah. So if you're constantly criticizing someone, you lose legitimacy in your criticism because you're the boy that's always crying wolf. Or if you're constantly praising them, you're not really being true to your principles, but rather you're being true to the person. You're turning yourself into a teenage fangirl for Justin Bieber. And so I think that, and again, when you look at his speech, I mean, you see everybody from Chris Cillizza at CNN to obviously even Bill Kristol was saying, it was a good speech. He gave a really good speech. Now, obviously, it's been overshadowed by a lot of what's happened. But again, that was one of my biggest concerns was seeing him on the campaign trail, just his kind of the loose lips. I was really worried, especially when you went overseas and there's just cultural mores and assumptions that require certain procedures and certain tightness. But I thought it was a good speech that he gave. And so I was really discouraged when I was reading some of the critiques that I just thought were so off.
Yeah, and again, one of them said, well, it was alt-right, and somebody responded saying, if everything's alt-right, nothing's alt-right, you know? And again, when the words the West, which are repeated 10 times, and civilization are repeated 5 times, that's reason enough to reject that. Of course, I also point out that he also mentioned God 10 times and reminded us of some very significant times in history, those of us a little bit older that lived through those, when there are people saying, we want God, and they're right there in the Warsaw area. And it just is amazing to me that when you start talking about the Warsaw Uprising, you talk about Lech Walesa, you talk about overthrowing communism, that ends up being seen as white supremacism. You've really gone to the wrong kind of part of the universe, haven't you?
I think that's like saying that if you're a patriot, then you're a racist bigot because our founding fathers had slaves. I mean, it's a bridge too far here. And I think that it discredits very real racial tensions that are existing right now. I mean, there are issues that need to be addressed and divisions in our country, but to say that everything equates to that, I think it undermines the very real issues that are currently existing. But I also think it's unfair. We can acknowledge our weaknesses as a civilization. We can acknowledge the dark history and the things that we should never defend, that we've grown from and we've come from. And at the end of the day, when I think of Western civilization, I identify it with so much spreading democracy and freedom. And something that President Bush really touted was in the hearts of every individual is the desire to be free. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that he tried to perpetuate. It's something my generation grew up understanding is we want others to have the independence and the freedoms we have, to have technological advances and the ability to decide your own careers and to pursue things you care about, to have a centered base. We talked earlier about having, a central base for morality and truth in God, and all of that is honorable.
Yeah, I can't help but think of the Reagan quote, right? So freedom is only one generation away from extinction, especially when Trump's over there in Poland, or was over there in Poland, rather. I think he's on his way over to France right now for Bastille Day with French Emmanuel Macron. But nevertheless, I completely agree with you. We need to remind ourselves of the exceptional nature of America because, again, if we don't remind ourselves, then we're just going to succumb and give in to some of these other narratives within the world. And that's what makes this democratic republic, this American experiment, so unique, in that we're just radically different than any other country that the world has ever seen. There used to be a day that government was the one that gives you powers. The American experiment said that your powers came from a certain inalienable right. Well, you have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the ownership of property. That we have to remind ourselves is just this ability to be able to, one, be free individuals, to be able to pursue after whatever it is that happiness is for you, and also your contributions that you would make to your community, which are just very radically different than the world has ever seen. And I think we need to continue to remind ourselves of this so that we don't fall into the traps of other nations that they.
This is a Millennial Round Table, so let's talk about this for just a minute, because a lot of your generation has been taught that you can't say one culture is better than another, one set of ethics is better than another. And yet it seems intuitively obvious that, Chelsey, let's just say, the rights of women in Western democracies are a lot better than the rights of women in the Middle East. And Donald Trump got himself in all sorts of trouble because he said, we produce symphonies. Okay, maybe there's a symphony now that you can find in the Middle East. And even, I love what Dennis Prager points out, that let's go to Japan. He says the Japanese would scoff at the idea that Bach and Beethoven did not write the greatest music ever composed. That is why some of the greatest Bach recordings of our time come from Japanese musicians living in Japan, nor would the Japanese deny that their modern country's democratic values come from the West. So part of the problem is millennials have been taught for some time you can't make choices. You can't say one culture is better than another, one set of ethics is better than another, right?
Right. I almost think this bordered on the line of embarrassment, because to tell countries that are viewing this who were in the Eastern Bloc in my lifetime and under the rule of thumb of communism, to say that, this is somehow, we're so self-absorbed that this speech was somehow, about what they made it about racism. I think that's just embarrassing. But I did say this. I've said it before. I'll say it again. My generation did not invent the political correctness that they were raised in. They were just raised in it.
We're looking at you, Kerby. Yeah. We're looking at you.
We didn't invent it. We were raised in it. I think that, we're seeing this across college campuses with, the basically blatant speech prohibitions that are occurring everywhere. Everyone's offended by everything.
Yeah, and I think, and this will be fun to talk about once we get back from the break, it's this idea of the progression of political correctness.
Yes,
and so what we saw in the 70s and 80s was political correctness and the unimatic theme of it, and then it's moved into empathetic correctness today, which is just, again, the trigger warnings, etc.
Yes. I was using to speak on college campuses in the 1970s. We never really saw political correctness, but boy, eventually it prevented us from speaking on campus because they said your values and your ideas aren't even allowed on campus. We're seeing that today. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Most people would expect liberals to be open-minded, and yet they find that they are often the most intolerant. Kim Holmes explores the reason for this transformation in his new book, The Closing of the Liberal Mind. He was on my radio program to talk about the history of the radical change in mindset and attitude. Now, classical American liberalism in this country was based on a belief in liberty. Citizens were to be free from government coercion and thus free to believe something different from the orthodoxy forced on it by the state. They were also free to discuss and debate, and most importantly was a belief in true tolerance, which accepted the right and freedom of others to believe differently from you. It was a live and let live philosophy. I may disagree with your views, but I would defend your right to believe them. That is not the view of the postmodern left today. They practice the politics of intolerance. They may think that they are tolerant, but really live in a world where bigotry and discrimination are allowed against any view that is not politically correct. They are willing to stifle free thought, censor free speech, and use public shaming in order to suppress any idea they do not like. Now, in his book, he talks about the campus bullies, but we also discussed how this has moved into even the business world. Now we have corporate bullies willing to use economic power to stifle and suppress legislation they abhor. He says we have a new ruling class that is wealthy, smart, well-connected, and formidable. Although their numbers are small, actually in the thousands, their influence in the media, in the academy, and in government is significant. They also believe that they have a higher truth which is superior to the common wisdom of the day. You know, we're in a battle with a new kind of liberal mind, and that is why we need to read about the closing of the liberal mind. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Nick Pitt's with us today, Chelsey Youman, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Augusta, Georgia here and talk to Tony. Tony, I think you would like to add some things to our conversation, so you have the floor.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking my call, Kerby. Well, historically, you know, when it comes to the black community, you know, a lot of our people just don't keep up with a lot of what's going on in the world today, globally, as well as locally. Domestically. You know, and it's historically, it's like the African American communities feel like they're kind of stuck in the past when it comes to historical slavery and the way the country is made up. And it's like they still haven't made their mind up. And of course, a lot of the deception when it comes to a lot of what you all have named now, because I was listening, you know, when it comes to the, you know, like academia, when it comes to media and stuff like that there. And because I was listening to your, that viewpoint piece, you know, just during the break, you know, about closing of the liberal mind. And it's just that, you know, a lot of African Americans, they're not really on to, you go ask them what is a liberal, a lot of them don't even know what the meaning of a lot of that stuff. I'm just being honest with you. As crazy as it may sound, socialism, Marxism and all that, and reading Karl Marx and all that, a lot of them do not know anything about that because they've been so programmed, you know, by the media historically and lied to so much by the Democratic Party. You go to talking to them about Frederick Douglass, about how he was how we can kind of look at him that he was somewhat of a Republican, stuff like that there. A lot of them are actually clueless to that stuff because they were so ingrained with hate and so well controlled to where, you know, it's like I would tell
I think I lost him there, but anyway, I think you get the point. Just clicked off. Unfortunately, we just had a problem with the phone there.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, this isn't just an African American issue, right? Like, I think there's just there's just this, and I don't mean this in the negative sense. Just ignorance is technically the word, but I feel like that's kind of got a negative tinge to it. But I mean, there's just an inability to be able to understand some of these individuals that have come before us. And so what we have are just these suitcase words, really, of just the liberal or the progressive or the conservative or the Republican. And they're just these suitcase words that we've forgotten what's actually inside of them because we never really knew what was inside of them. And we just throw them out and throw them around at people. And these charged words typically are used simply to offer up critiques of the side, and they're not really proponents for what they want when they eradicate the other side, which is just, again, is just not the way we move towards a more perfect union.
Isn't this the value, though, of a program like Point of View? We're trying to educate people, about these issues. And I recognize a lot of people tell me I listen to Point of View because, let's be honest, I gotta go to work. I gotta raise my family. I just don't have time to read the kinds of things that Nick Pitts reads every single day.
Nobody should have to endure such punishment. Nobody should have to.
I don't have the opportunity to go to law school like Chelsey, so I depend on you to give us some perspective and some insight because I can't get it anywhere else.
Look, and I always say if the only source we have to know what's going on is the media, then you are going to have a liberal slant in what you know. And I think that's the same issue with millennials that we've been talking about, that just an indoctrination in a time where we have to see both sides and seek to know and understand both sides.
What about this idea of political correctness? We mentioned that just before we went to the break, and there was a time in which I can remember this, maybe because I'm the oldest one around the table, in the 1970s when I would be invited in to speak, and there were campuses that I would speak in quite regularly with the ministry that I did with Pro Ministries. We would have liberal professors invite us in and say, look, you've had a chance to hear my perspective, and in the fairness of academic freedom, I want you to hear this perspective. And sometimes I get up there and say, your professors paid you a high compliment that you actually will hear one lecture from me without having your whole life ruined. But then that changed pretty quickly, where professors eventually said, we don't believe that your view deserves a hearing. And they couldn't say that you were wrong because, after all, we believe all values are relative, all ethics are relative. So they had to come up with a different way, and that was to say it's not politically correct. And your views have subjugated minorities and women and other things. And so eventually that's how the university closed down. Today, we can go to Middlebury University, we can go to the University of California at Berkeley or anywhere else and see that these are really closed institutions.
Yeah, I mean, what you see in the 70s and 80s is this rise of political correctness. And at the very heart, if we want to look through rose-colored glasses and we want to think about the loving perspective, which a Christian is to be characterized by love, and love is always looking for the best and seeking to redeem the worst. If you look at political correctness from a loving perspective, what you're going to see is this desire for unity.
Yeah.
That political correctness is trying to get everybody underneath the same tent. So what does political correctness do? It tries to shut down individuals. As a result, it tries to shut down individuals that would try to keep people outside the tent, to be exclusive by nature. So there's a good intent for political correctness to try to keep everybody in, but a bad ramification, which you're silencing voices that are dissenting or that would keep individuals from being underneath the tent. What we've seen today is the evolution from political correctness to empathetic incorrectness, which is this understanding of the trigger warning. So it's not even just what you say, but it's what you could potentially make me feel that might make me feel excluded. Hence the reason why you have microaggressions that are coming on, the trigger warning component. You can't even potentially entertain the idea that might do me emotional harm. And so now we find ourselves in a point where we're having to not just not say anything, but not say. It's just unfathomable, because we've forgotten the whole idea that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, no, now we live in a world where words can hurt you, and words do hurt you. And so, again, if I played out your argument, and again, I'm talking way too much, Chelsey. You just need to interrupt me right now.
No,
and so
we're learning. He's giving a history lesson.
So if I play this out, and if I look at it from a liberal perspective, and so if you think about a liberal, they would say, well, your ideas aren't worth hearing, and that's why you can't be a part of this. Well, then what has the conservative movement done? There have been isolated individuals within the conservative movement that have lived into that narrative and have spewed forth hate speech, simply just trying to, what we would say are firebrands today, that really aren't putting forward an idea that's worth hearing. They're just criticizing everything. Yeah. And so conservatives are living into that idea when we don't use those opportunities, though they're few and far between, to actually present a case that moves us more towards a more perfect union.
Very good.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of this with the phenomenon of what I like to call labeling. When we can't address the issue directly or the underlying principles directly, what we do is we're just going to, and by we, I mean the left, jokingly. Yeah. What the left does is they'll just label someone. All of a sudden, we don't understand how the marginalized middle class or the rural areas of our country can reject our side so blatantly. So what we're going to do is just name everyone who voted for Trump and Trump a bigot. And that's what we're going to do. They're racist and they're bigoted. And so by labeling someone, not only do you shut down the conversation, what happens is people are fearful to be associated with it or to enter the conversation or to even say they voted for Trump because they don't want to be labeled in that way. And so it is actually a really effective tactic if you're the left to shut down the other side.
And the reality of the matter is labels are great for soup cans, but they're awful for people. Because at the end of the day, we are so much more than our ideas. But again, and if we circle back to the conversation we were having earlier before the break, it's this understanding that we're no longer participating in these intermediary institutions that are giving us that rich sense of identity. I am more than my ideas. I'm more than my mind. And when I recognize that I'm more than my ideas, I can be proven wrong, and it doesn't kill me. As a matter of fact, it only enriches my life because I'm living into it. I'm living more closely aligned with the truth, one, and then two, I'm eradicating that misperception within my own mind, because when we're aligned closely with the truth, it allows for the flourishment of life wherever it is.
Let's go back to the phones. And Maddie in Georgia. Maddie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I really appreciate what I'm hearing today, and especially the panel member who stated that we need to be very honest about those things that are wrong or right and not to just blow either one of them up. But I think that with political correctness, I believe that we're operating today on the presumption that to be politically correct, you have to be rude, uncaring.
Oh, yeah.
And
Preach.
Something that I'm not in agreement with. I believe that I've grown up, I'm like 67 years old, but I have known of political correctness even in my growing up, and it was never tarnished the way it is now. But I think that some people believe that they have a right because of position of power to say whatever they want to say. But I believe we all go back to what the democratic principle or the republic principle of our country was established. It's all on treating people the way that they should be treated according to what the Bible tells us.
Golden rule.
If we do that,
yes.
I have friends, I'm African American. I have friends who voted for President Trump. I have some who did not. And as I mentioned to the young lady, I had reached a point in my time, I voted Democrat, but there's a time when I struggled very strongly against that because I agree with many of the principles of the Republican Party.
Can I put you on hold? We have to go to a mandatory break. You've got some great things to say. I've just come into a break. Can I hold you over? And we'd love to hear a little bit more of your comments right after these important messages.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-8888. 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. And pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Nick Pitts with us and Chelsey Youman. I might just mention before we're done that we'll talk a little bit about the Denison Forum on Truth and Culture and also First Liberty. But Maddie, you're with us as well, and I appreciate some of the comments you've made, and you had some people shaking their heads around the table. But do you have some final comments you want to leave with our listeners and our guests around the table?
Well, I think that we're better as a whole than we are in pieces. And right now we're showing a lot of our pieces, which are not reflective of our whole that has been established by our forefathers, regardless of the color. I think that if we take time to look at how great America is and all that it is, from one party to the other, that we will find some way to come together, because it's very frustrating for the average Joe or Joanne to try to put this thing in perspective. It's not about any particular party. It's about the people, and it's about doing those things that are right. And sometimes you have to be a little courageous in order to do it. There are many things on the Democratic side. I think there are too much spending in certain programs. And I think on the Republican side, there might be some things that need to happen otherwise. But I think if we can get the right body of people in that Congress to come together, to lay down all of the words that divide us, I think that we'll be able to get something good out of all of this, and even out of this administration.
I sure want this Congress to get some work done, if nothing else, and I would like them to come together. It's really tough, isn't it?
It's very tough, but I think that they have to lay party aside and do what is best for all of the people, because not all of the people are with the same party, but all of the people have the same needs, to be honest with you. We all want the same thing as was established early on or laid out. We all have the basic needs that are very important. We want to have a good life. We want our children to have a good life, and I think that is the foundation of making a great America and having passing things on to the next generation. And we can't do that with all of the fighting that's going on and the loose lips that are creating more havoc within relationships within our country. Because there are some people you have to fringe who will latch on to anything just to be a part.
Yeah, there are two things, Maddie, Miss Maddie, that you bring up that I think are so illuminating, and I'm just smiling from ear to ear about, because I think you're so right. The first being the idea that political correctness is a license to be able to say whatever you want. I think we've lost the civility that's increasingly becoming less and less apparent within the public sphere. I think it's something that we need to be worried about. It's okay to disagree with one another, but we shouldn't denigrate and demonize one another. And then I would say the second thing that you kind of brought up towards the end of your comments would be this politicalization of our culture today, that we being tribal individuals are increasingly seeing ourselves and identifying ourselves by our political party. And I'm kind of reminded of what Samuel Johnson said. So Samuel Johnson writes, "Of all that the human heart endures, that part which laws and kings can cause or cure."
I quote that oftentimes.
I just think we are just, there's so much.
There's only so much law can do.
Yeah, there's
much of it is culture.
Yeah, and we just have to continue to remind ourselves, especially as Christians, that we have been, the Spirit of the living God has been placed within us, and greater is He that is in us than he that is in the world, that allows us to be able to do more than we can ask or imagine as we continue to extend His kingdom. And when His kingdom's extended, the flourishment of life happens, the joy abounds, and it's always for the good of the world.
You know, she was talking about coming together, and one of the things in the Dennis Prager piece is that the University of California at Berkeley, since I'm from Berkeley, I can relate to this only so well, they have a list of microaggression statements, and one of those is the phrase, "There is only one race, the human race," which actually is the book of Acts, because it says we're all of one blood. So how do you come together if it's a microaggression to say that ultimately what we see as major racial differences from a genetic point of view are so very real insignificant, and there really is only one race, the human race. But that's a microaggression. That keeps us from getting together, doesn't it?
Well, this reminds me of a really good example. I'm sure all of our listeners were doing this yesterday afternoon as well, but I was watching some Senate committee hearings out of the state of California.
Oh, no.
Because I'm a nerd.
Hey.
But no, there's some important religious liberty legislation I do want to talk about maybe before we get off. But one of the bills that was up before our bill that we're interested in was talking about immigration on campus. Okay, and so I haven't heard a lot of this. I'm not very indoctrinated with California. I am a Texan. Frankly, most of our cases are not out of California because it's very difficult to win there. But people are getting up and testifying and saying the most racist things have been said on our campuses. Phrases like the word illegal immigrants. that was an example of a word that alien is no longer allowed. And these are, by the way, legal terms. I mean, these are terms that are in statutes that. Yeah. So I was just very surprised to see how far we've come, that even you can't acknowledge that someone, is not legally does not have a legal status to be in our country is considered an aggression, not just a microaggression. And so I was a little bit taken aback that we can't say the word alien anymore. I mean, these terms that I use as an attorney in describing our immigration status in our country, I mean, we can't go that far anymore. And so I'm not sure how we can quantify these really important issues if we can't discuss them.
So you're saying I can't say alien ant farm, which as a 90s kid, it just resonates.
I'm feeling
so
very threatened
deeply.
right now.
Yeah, smooth criminal. But I know that's Michael Jackson. I know that Michael Jackson listeners, but Alien Ant Farm 1990s version is a phenomenal cover.
It certainly is. Okay, we'll get from cover songs to how we are ruining America, because I think Maddie set us up. David Brooks the other day wrote in the New York Times that we are in one way or another really beginning to segment our society, not so much on the basis of race as on the basis of class. And his argument is that upper middle class moms have the means and the ability to actually begin to give their kids a one-upmanship, and there is certainly some understanding of that. But what about this? Because it has led to a firestorm of criticism of David Brooks, and I know you wanted to speak to this issue for a minute.
I have full-on bias right now. I have, in millennial terms, what's called a man crush on David. Him and John Meacham. I mean, I'd read their grocery lists if they let me. Yeah. I mean, I really do. I love some of the stuff that they're writing. And so David Brooks just kind of, again, using what David Brooks has always done, which he only writes 876 words. This is not on the internet. It's available on the internet, but it's only in print. Using his 876 words, he tried to highlight the problem of one, the social chasm that's being created, yes. 1, 2, and the inability and this economic stagnation that's happening, and a further divide between the classes. Something that many can agree on, despite a couple of others. But in true David Brooks fashion, what he does is he often utilizes anecdotes every once in a while, and then his snark, which he's been doing since he wrote his first book on Paradise Drive, and that's caused such an uproar. And so specifically, we've got a little bit of time. I'm just going to read this one paragraph, or really, he gives this anecdotal one paragraph, and so I thought I'd read it for a second.
Sure.
He said, "Recently, I took a friend with only a high school degree to lunch. Insensitively, I led her into a gourmet sandwich shop. Suddenly, I saw her face freeze up as she was confronted with sandwiches named Padrino or Pomodoro and ingredients like sopressado. I can't even pronounce these. It's okay. I quickly asked her if she wanted to go somewhere else, and she anxiously nodded yes, and we ate Mexican." Again, what we're seeing is just there's these insulary communities that are just continuing to be a part of this, and he was just using that to highlight the social chasm that's being created. Because he used this paragraph, it's causing individuals to point to elitism, to point to this is just David Brooks sneering right now. And it's just ludicrous. It's just ludicrous.
But again, the point that he makes is also one that I made in my commentary the other day, that certain individuals live in a bubble. And the people that live in the bubble the most are in the Upper East Side in Manhattan, Silicon Valley. Even here, he talks about the people that actually have the kind of stratified idea, and he says Portland, New York, and San Francisco. So some of the people that think they're really cosmopolitan actually in these blue states and these blue cities live so divorced from the rest of the culture that, back to Chelsey's point, the fact that those people voted for Donald Trump shows what? They're bigots.
Well, right. I mean, they can't quantify what we're calling the Trump phenomenon of last year.
They can't even understand it. Yeah.
No, they can't understand it. It's something that political scientists are going to spend years trying to unravel. But instead of trying to relate and understand our brothers and sisters across our country who live in different places, in different locations with different jobs and different economic statuses, instead of trying to understand our brothers and sisters, they insulate further with themselves. They only talk to each other, and they're completely isolated from reality.
And yeah, and David Brooks he did a really good job. And again, it's backed up by social science, which was so frustrating because I even saw some on the right that continued to say, well, no, we're not at a stagnant ability. Well, Well, if you look at the science right now, and I know we're about to run out of break, so I'll do real quickly. If you look at the social science right now, University of Massachusetts has came out with a study that said we're in an economic stagnation right now, regardless of whether you're whatever your college education is, with that there's no upward mobility. And then there's another study that I'll touch on when we get back to after the break that not only illuminates this problem but further divides the problem as well.
Yeah. This is the problem we have in America, and sometimes it doesn't matter who you elect to office. A lot of it's cultural, and it just shows it's the things that kings and laws cannot change. Be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A Massachusetts church is accused of violating the separation of church and state because it rents space from the local school district. Town leaders of Southbridge, Massachusetts have raised concerns about Iglesia Casa de Destinos' rented use of a public school in its town. The church pays the standard rate to use the school's auditorium once per week, like many churches do across the country. But the church is known in the community for its conservative religious beliefs. One of the town councilmen is openly questioning whether the church should have a standing agreement to use the property. Not only is the building expensive to operate, the councilman suggested that the agreement could violate the so-called separation of church and state. Well, not likely. The Supreme Court has twice upheld the practice. A town is, of course, under no obligation to rent its facility to anyone, but historically, publicly owned schools have been used and rented by a variety of organizations, including churches. Once a school district decides that it will rent its facilities to the community, it would be unlawful religious discrimination to prevent churches from renting the space. As the Supreme Court observed in the 1981 decision of Widmer versus Vincent, the Constitution forbids a state to enforce certain exclusions from a forum generally open to the public, even if it was not required to create the forum in the first place. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I got a feeling there's going to be a Nick Pitts commentary on this.
Oh, yeah.
And there's going to be a Kirby Anderson commentary on that, so you can get that one as well. But Nick, really what we're talking about here is there used to be a time in which you assumed upward mobility. And there are a lot of indices that up until about the time Bill Clinton came into office, that there was a lot of upward mobility. An immigrant comes here and within a generation owns a factory, owns a business, owns a pizza parlor, whatever, and the kids go on and become valedictorians in their school. But what David Brooks is pointing out, and the quotes that he's bringing from a number of other individuals, Richard Reeves in particular, dream hoarders, is that upward mobility isn't happening so much. And it isn't because of racism per se, because in some respects we're not so much separated by race as we are by class.
Yeah.
And there's certain class distinctions that he's talking about, certain cultural things, and in addition to residential zoning restrictions. and gated communities, let's just go all the way down the road here, that are keeping people separated and not working together,
right?
So
let's think about this for a second. So a study out of the Financial Times reports that in 1970, those 30-year-olds had a 90% chance of making more than their parents at that age. In 1980, 30-year-olds had an 80% chance of making more. In 2016, half of 30-year-olds made the same. The other half made less, obviously. And that holds when they were at 40 years old to their parents' generation. I mean, what we're seeing is a stagnation. Stagnation, one, so there's not the upward mobility. And then two, I think what Robert Putnam, which we say his name time and time again because he's often very right when it comes to this, is what we're seeing is there's a dichotomy that's being positioned within our culture today, that there's the haves and the have-nots. There's their kids and then there's our kids. And contingent and implicit within upward mobility is the two groups coming together. Because when the two groups come together, one, you learn about the social mores, and then two, there's examples and there's a sharing of resources that provides that ability to be able to see upward mobility. But increasingly, because their kids and our kids are not coming together, what we're seeing is just, again, stagnation, one, and then two, there's no longer upward mobility. And that's been a part of the American dream since the founding, of one generation of doing better than the previous generation, of parents giving their children something better.
You know, when Bill Clinton ran for the presidency, he made a big case about this. But the point is you can't solve some of this politically. You solve it culturally. And part of it is, again, since we're using our hands, a lot of us grew up in a time when you had sort of this idea of a bell-shaped curve, but it's curving off. And you have the haves and the have-nots. You have those who are well-educated and those who are poorly educated. Those who are culturally literate and those who are culturally illiterate. Those who are biblically literate, those who are biblically illiterate. And so as a result, you really have, in your generation, more than any other generation, the millennial generation, a kind of a dichotomy that never really has existed.
We're seeing
before.
the hollowing out of the middle class right now. And again, you made a really good point about the cultural component to it. I mean, just think about it for a second. When is the last time that you went to dinner with someone that was less than, right? Or not less than from a personal standpoint, but that was of a different socioeconomic status than you are? When you think about your neighborhoods, you're largely looking at homogeneous mixes in your neighborhoods. When you look at your churches, what are you saying? Homogeneous mixes. If we're speaking about it from a millennial perspective, what are we seeing? We're seeing the rise of these churches that are, I praise God for these churches, but we're seeing a rise of churches that are largely just 20 and 30-year-olds, and there's just not an older generation. We're segmenting not only by class, but we're segmenting by age, and what we're experiencing rather, is the detrimental effects of that.
Yes. Well, again, we talk about this Millennial Round Table. These are some conversations that we're going to have in the future, so I'm looking forward to those as well. Chelsey, let me give you some of the last words here. Any thoughts about some of the things we've covered today, just before we talk about the wonderful websites both of you have here?
Yeah, so I just want to end on an encouraging note and say that I always have to do this, guys. The world is not completely falling apart. No, but I get, I just have the honor in my job of getting to see people who just rally towards their Christian beliefs and conservative ideals, and people who are willing to take a stand and put their necks out there. Some of them are fired for their beliefs, very literally fired for their religious beliefs or convictions, who are willing to just be courageous. And so I want to encourage our listeners out there to continue to do that.
Well, let's go to firstliberty.org. First of all, we always encourage people to sign up. I just sent my contribution into First Liberty and made sure that I was continued to support that organization. I encourage you to do so. And as you sign up, you can actually receive a regular email about some of the cases that you've got coming down the pike, don't you?
That's right. And I mentioned earlier that I was listening to some testimony in the California legislature. And so here's just a plug for anyone who's a religious entity in California, so a nonprofit, a church even, a religious hospital. California is trying to pass a measure that's going to limit their ability to have pro-life statements of faith and employ people who are pro-life in their religious organizations. If you have a question about how this is going to impact you, or maybe want to see what you can do about it, please call us. We are looking for clients on that front.
That would be very good. Also, the Denison Forum is certainly a great resource. And you can go to denisonforum.org. First of all, of course, we always talk about the daily briefing by Nick Pitts, but I also might mention your boss, Dr. Jim Denison, has an email resource for preaching pastors called Cultural Preaching. What's that all about?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. It's this new initiative we launched about 4 or 5 months ago. It's this opportunity to really want to help resource pastors to be able to provide them with materials that, one, might be culturally appropriate as they try to lead the flock that's been entrusted to them to better understand the times. And then, two, just try to be an encouragement to pastors. And so you can sign up on our website, and we'll send an email out once a week. You'll get one of Jim's sermons that he's preaching from that Sunday, as well as just some other cultural material that might be applicable to you as you try to lead your people into that sphere. But then also, I just highly recommend what Jim really does send out, just a phenomenal little piece called the Daily Article Every Day, which, again, he just tries to tackle one particular issue in the morning and really think about it from a biblical perspective. And so, yeah, it was just so timely today. We were talking about it because should I attend a gay wedding? Was the one
that was
for
a very
today.
Good piece today.
Just a great, just logically thought through it. But just in irony of ironies, we come to find out that was released today that Eugene Peterson came out and said that he would officiate a same-sex wedding. So it's just, again, the coincidence, but ever the need to be able to speak the truth in love. And
again, I also support the Denison Forum. And when I did the other day, I got my copy of 7 Critical Issues. That's his book, right?
Yeah. And so what he wants
to
really, this is our kind of first book move that we moved into kind of the political world, and just tried to think about the 7 issues that are really kind of continually a part of the political dialogue, and try to ask and answer, what is it that God thinks about these issues? What's the biblical narrative speak to these particular issues?
One more time, Chelsey, let's talk about anything that people want to get information on. Maybe they're saying, I get concerned that my business isn't allowing me to exercise my religious liberty. Can they give you a call and find out more about what those rights might be?
Absolutely. Go to firstliberty.org. You can either call us. You could also submit a request for legal help. Or we also have resources online so that you don't have to, you can know your own rights without having to get a hold of an attorney. We have workplace right kits. We have, if you're a religious organization, church, or school even, we've got protection and coverage and resources for you on our website.
Yeah, again, so go to those 2 websites and you're going to find some great information.
So contra to what we learned in the 1980s, you don't call Ghostbusters if you have a problem. You call First Liberty.
You could. I don't know if they'll answer.
Yeah. So if you have any plumbing issues, you call First Liberty. No, I'm just kidding. You call Denison Forum for that. We'll help out.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you both for being here. Let's look forward to the next opportunity. And Nick, one last time, thank you for sitting in this chair last week.
Always so good to sit there for you, but even more to sit here with me.
Yes. Well, we covered a lot of issues, and if you find yourself wanting some more information, we have a number of articles posted. We have links to both the websites, and as you go to the website, I hope you'll also click on that button that says donate, because if you can support us, we will be able to continue bringing these programs to you. Even though we're going off the air, we still will take a call on our pledge line in case you'd like to talk to someone about giving to this ministry. 800-347-5151. I want to thank Andrew and Lisa for their help behind the scenes. See you tomorrow.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.